Welcome to the Cormac McCarthy Underground, everybody. We are here with another McCarthyan renegade, the world of AJP. You guys have to check out his YouTube channel. He is one of the few McCarthyans that isn't. One of the few, even the bad ones. There's not that many. So, how are you doing today, AJP?
I'm doing pretty great today. Just glad to be talking about one of my favorite authors of all time, getting ready to shoot the shit, act like an idiot for a couple of while, but good old classic fun.
Hey, let's go. When did you first encounter Cormac?
Well, I read his stuff when I was pretty young because we had this public library near our school, specifically out in the ghetto. And I remember specifically, I was looking for something about cowboys, and my librarian pretty much said, "Hey, read Cormac McCarthy. Blood Meridian is a really great book about that type of stuff." I was like, I can never remember how old I was. I was either 8 or I was like 10 or 11. It was like elementary school and all that type of stuff. And I ended up reading that book, and I was an idiot, and I didn't understand anything that was going on in that book. I just knew for a fact, I read chapter 4. I remember Holden, and that's like the most I remembered as a kid. But I was obsessed with that book because I read that book specifically, and The Sound and the Fury when I was like a kid, and those books just like pretty much just drew me down the pipeline. Pretty much that, and the Book of Disquiet by Fernando Pessoa. I really love that book as well. Just like a decline into literature and all that type of stuff, and it's never been the same since.
Dang, wow. I mean, shout out that librarian. 10-year-old walks in and say, "Oh, here you go, Blood Meridian." Jesus Christ. Jeez, man, that's great though. I mean, I had something similar with like 12, 13 years old encountering McCarthy, other people, and it's like very formative. I mean, I think that's super cool. I mean,
Yeah, it
yeah, I
is.
mean,
It really is.
that's yeah.
Yeah, especially because like there's such like in terms of prose and character, like you can really see the influence like Faulkner has in a lot of ways. Like it wasn't with specifically Blood Meridian, but with Suttree a lot. You can see a lot of like that sort of like flipping a stream of consciousness and like identity and like sort of like the thought process Suttree goes within that book. And it really just I think like the impact that had on McCarthy just goes really a lot understated. Like obviously that book is like an icon of literature for good reason. That book is like the peak of like characterization and mental process. But it's also like one of those few books that I think just like doesn't get enough recognition because of that at the same time. Like it's more genuinely accepted, but it's just like it's a book that haunts you. Like everything McCarthy does, all the stuff with like the Southern Gothic literature, like despite the prose being a bit simple at times and the syntax not really being like Nabokov level of complicated, like there's a reason why he hated Faulkner. You can really just see like sort of like the psychological imprinting that book has on you because it's just like it haunts you a lot in the ways like it's just like how it goes and imprints itself in your mind.
Yeah, and Albert Eskrin, McCarthy's editor, was Faulkner's editor. So like, and when he encountered McCarthy for the first, with the Orchard Keeper, he really dialed him down, like really reined him in. And I think obviously helped him, even though McCarthy had already read Faulkner and was imitating him at some level, and was inspired by him. I think that was even another punch. Like then you get his editor, and yeah, and I flip back and forth between how influenced he was. Like people say all the time, like he was there's a New York Times review of the Orchard Keeper in like 63, and it says another Faulkner copycat. And like I don't think it's that bad. I mean, I don't think it's like that bad. I just think like
Yeah,
why not? Like there's a legend in your area who's writing about similar things and it's dark. Why wouldn't you like move with him? And I think there's enough variation. Like um yeah, anyway, like I've been like doing a lot of comparisons, and like McCarthy is a lot more heavy on like verbs and like vocabulary and language, even though Faulkner does do have a crazy vocab. He has crazy vocab too, but McCarthy has a more aggressive prose, and like I don't know, they're similar
yeah.
but not.
Yeah, you can really see that because immediately, like, I'm not saying like he was like a copycat of Faulkner completely. Like, I'm gonna be honest, that's a load of shit. Really, McCarthy has his own creative voice, his own creative spirit in a lot of ways, but he combines a whole bunch of like authors he adores and loves, and fuses them together in this like wonderful way. Because you can very obviously see like how Hemingway, in fact, affected McCarthy's writing a lot, especially with like his use of like syntax, use of punctuation, getting rid of that. It's like downright to the commas. You can even see like sort of like the Homer influence there as well, with a lot of the poetic verbosity he has, this power, this awe-inducing might, especially with Blood Meridian. Like that book is really does feel like the American epic, and I mean that not necessarily like it's grand in scale and all that type of stuff. I mean like in the context of like being like the Ida or the Aeneid, which I would get into later about the Border trilogy, but the Blood Meridian feels like the encompassing spirit of like the West and our decline in a lot of ways, like in a general scale, and not just America, but about the Celtic, Danish, German, a lot of like fallen empires, and just sort of how the spirit of that still carried on into America. Even like the peak of civilization and freedom and democracy, and the corruption from those old wars and things like that. How that sort of like encompasses the book a lot, especially right from the beginning. Like, see the child, that very much invokes Nordic literature, and like that very much started like witness, see, lay witness to this carnage, to this brutality, to the spirits of these mighty heroes, and sort of twist that and morphs it into like the very culture of like the American West, and how that went with the scalping years and everything like that.
Boom, dropping bombs already. AJP, everyone. I've never thought of that. That makes sense with the Nordic literature and the invoking. Wow. Boom. Like, guys, like everyone, before we let AJ go, I mean, AJP go any further, like, guys, this is where it's at. Like, independent, random dudes out there living in the desert. Like, it's like the scholars, they're getting paid to do this. We're doing this for free. I mean, we don't, there's no money at the end of this, you guys. Like, I've, um, yeah, like, oh my god. Do you think that? Well, I already read your comment on this, but I want to ask you and go a little bit more in depth with this. Do you think that McCarthy post Suttree and Blood Meridian shifted consciously how he was going to write books?
I think he did, and we obviously don't know too much about what happened between all the pretty horses, all that great when it came to McCarthy specifically. Like, you could find the drafts down at the McCarthy archive and everything like that, but you can't really find much of what was going through McCarthy when he came to that shift. Like, we never had like a eureka moment or anything like that. Like, we don't have like the detailed like Urschleim and zoology and botany thing we had with Blood Meridian's notes and all that type of stuff. We just have a general idea of like maybe he was told and recognized the fact that he wasn't getting the success he wanted, and writing in like a Joycean sort of like Samuel Beckett kind of fashion of writing, and shifted towards more so like Henry Miller, stuff like that, with Tropic of
Yeah.
Cancer, Tropic of Capricorn, stuff like that, where the prose is very, very poetic, very strong, very stream of consciousness, and very simplistic at times, but it has a very delicate Robert Frost poetry to it, like a lot of meter, a lot of beauty, a lot of aesthetic elements to it. It's a lot more simple and conventional at times, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing compared to what we had before. Like, you still have these grand philosophical quandaries and a lot of spirit of like life and death and how that relates to us. I think just like it was definitely sort of like a shift in how media and itself like presents itself a lot. Like, but it's still experimental. Like, it's not so much like Gravity's a rainbow anymore. Like with Peichin, or I say Peichen because I think Peichin's a stupid way to say his name. I know that's how you say it, but with Peichen, you really do see like that shift as well with Violent and Against the Day and all the stuff like that. It's, I think, just a recognition of having this sort of change. We want to get your ideas out there. I don't think McCarthy's sold out or anything like that. I think it's just like a recognition that he wanted to change the personality of those books specifically because they're about the West. And I think he was invoking more Hemingway, more Fitzgerald, more of these like cowboy pulps and cinematic things like that to sort of like build upon that specifically.
Yeah, and I wonder because during that era between the late 70s and the 80s, he was starting to work on screenplays. That was like the big screenplay time. I mean, basically most of them were written during that time, and like you were saying, like that seemingly a move to something more cinematic, more pulpy, and like he was probably like, what, how far can I've already taken myself to the heights of like literary merit with Suttree and Blood Meridian, and you could keep doing that for the rest of your life, but if you that transition, I feel like is just as masterful. When I read those books, I'm like, to be able to limit yourself and to inject beauty with minimalism, I think is just as good.
Oh yeah, and you can definitely see like sort of like the influence Samuel Beckett had when it came to his screenplays as well. Like Wells and Men, like everyone can judge that as like a movie instead like, oh, it has like no real plot or anything like that, but it's a very art house kind of work with that, how that went. And The Sunset Limited, which I think is McCarthy's best play, like period. That's like an encompassing thing about his whole like conflict about literature and everything like that. It's the Beckettian ritual. And this is more so from people smarter than me, like actual academics, but like they recognize like the influence he had, and that it's focused on not really like grand ideas, but like the small scale encompassing values and conflicts we have in our day to day, God, religion, Christianity, philosophy, and of course, intelligence, and how that's always been like sort of a factor of McCarthy against the primacy of nature, like, how Marquis de Sade discuss, nature versus civilization, and Paglia, with her whole focus on like civilization being our defense against the, the fascistic nature of, well, nature. And it's a very much like a sort of common threshold there of how intelligence becomes its own weapon by our own nature specifically. And I know that sounds pretentious as hell to say, but it's a common threshold, like how much of a burden intelligence can be, how much of a gift that can get manipulated at times. Like with the road, like the father, like it's hinted at that he was a physicist before and almost outright stated, and he has a very like almost like optimistic worldview of like trying to carry the fire against like a dismal dying out world, like a sort of Promethean spirit there, and that ends up getting extinguished, but he ends up passing that on to his family, obviously. And in every other book, that's usually like, the decline, like, with Alice in or Alicia in Stella Maris, you have that issue of like intelligence and it being sort of like an isolating factor to us a lot, as well with like, every other book, with Holden being the intelligence used for manipulation, control, domination, very Oswald Spengler and ramifications a lot of the way, sort of like a Nine of the Knives type of situation there with his whole escapade. And then as well with like, the Sunset Limited, that being a man who is so intelligent he just can't find any joy in simple things, versus a man who's more or less ignorant but has sort of that perspective. And that I think the Sunset Limited really does speak to like everything McCarthy discusses, and I feel like these last two books of his really are just like all of his themes combined and analyzed and discussed and put through like a grinder to try and just like encompass everything about life he could towards the end. And as well, the big thing, death, like how that affects us and whether or not that's even an end anymore through science or religion, things like that specifically.
Spot on analysis. And it's interesting that at the start of his career, he was writing about and like pushing back against progress. And then he transitioned to, like you said, with some of his later works with what happens with too much intelligence, what happens when things go too far. And I think, I'm sure he discovered that at the Santa Fe Institute, on his own, because like you see a lot of the figures that he focuses on. I can't remember the one guy that eventually quit and became a sheep farmer, the physicist, but that he wrote about in Stella Maris. But it's isolating, and he went through 3 wives. I mean, being a writer, having this supreme intelligence, it's a very isolating thing, and him bringing it to us, like the readers, anyone who's going to sit down and read The Passenger in Stella Maris has probably experienced like intellectual isolation before, like not having people to talk to, not being able to like do these things, and like
Yeah, and
he's
the fucked
romantic
up.
and he's
Yeah, I was gonna say,
the,
it's like the fucked up part is like he kind of is right, because people like specifically call The Passenger and Stella Mars like it just feels like a bunch of Wikipedia notes about physics and all this, like, and like it alienated people from these books specifically, like to like introduce and branch these ideas of like not only just philosophy but just like quantum physics and how they work and the history of them. And it had that effect where people just grew less interested in the books because of that specifically. Like it it just like they couldn't get their heads around it, and it was too difficult, too complex. And it's just like, yeah, that does happen at times with like these pursuits of intelligence. Like at times it feels like you're crossing off people who can't really like discuss these ideas with, like, and that's a shame really, like a lot of time. And it seems like it happened more and more, like meritocracy even like in the academics kind of loses its value at times as well.
No, yeah. I mean, and I didn't really find that critique because he never really went that deep. Like, I just have a passer, but I've read a couple introductory books on quantum physics and whatnot, and he didn't really lose, and just general knowledge of the other sciences, humanities. He didn't really lose me in those books at all. Even before I researched and like clarified, it really wasn't that hard. I mean, did you feel like you were like a fish out of water at any time?
No, I have a friend who's actually is a physicist, and I was very interested in physics as a whole when I was younger. Like I always wanted to just because it's a very attractive field to go for. You shouldn't really see people talking about it because it's just like, oh, we want to bring up quantum physics over some coffee, man. Like let's just go fucking go. Like you don't really have that type of
Yeah.
thing, really not in the day to day. But I understand McCarthy's attraction to like discussing like with intelligent people, like actually intelligent people, like not like the fox paw like writer persona, like, oh, I read some good old Hemingway and I am the encompassing
Yeah.
truth about writing and all this type of shit. Like none of that bullshit. Like not like how Proust can be tend to be, or Proust, however you want to pronounce it, like that type of like arrogance at times. It's just like it's a true like actual intelligence and like understanding of how our world functions and trying to break that down and understand it. Like, so I wasn't really like too like out of water there because I studied a lot of the people he was discussing this with, like, a lot of their ideas, a lot of their quantum physics, and regarding to like the psyche and stuff like that. And it's a very interesting thing he has there. And also because like with philosophy itself, like a lot of them were focusing on Newtonian physics as well, so you kind of had to study them and understand like a lot of the ideas they were trying to go for, like Philip Mainlander specifically, like his whole theory around gas and motion, like it's such a very bizarre thing, but it's like it's applicable with anti-gravity atomic particles there. It's a controversial theory, admittedly, but it's like you have to understand how physics go for the metaphysics specifically, and that's why you kind of have to get invested, especially with how important it is, even for like the Greeks with atomicism and a lot of these like Aristotelian metaphysics and how that goes from there.
No, 100%. Yeah. And that's one of my favorite parts about McCarthy since I was young, when he would just talk shit about writers and the guys like you and me sitting here right now. He was like, "No, fuck those guys. I'm gonna go talk to the physicists. I'm gonna talk to the smartest people in the world." And like we all kind of idealize. Like I always like think like, "Oh man, like what if I could go and do that?" Like that's always some like far off thing. And and I guess he didn't do that in the sense that he was a part of like pool hall clubs and like had a bunch of random friends and would be picking up chicks at bars and stuff. And so like he was also a man's man and like went golfing and would talk to people and whatnot. So I guess that's just like the most. But do you feel like that's a front? Like just not to get into psychoanalysis, but I've always thought that like that was just a major front by McCarthy, that like, I don't want to talk to other writers, like just as like to create the mysterious persona to make sure that you didn't have to talk to anybody.
Admittedly, I could kind of understand the sentiment a bit because I met writers and they're fucking annoying. But it's definitely a case of where I think it might be a mix of like I don't really want to talk to people, so I'm just gonna say I don't like them versus like because we do have like some like hearsay stories. Like again, it's hearsay, which we don't know. I'm not trying to get all armchair psychology here, but McCarthy apparently like is like very distant like from like the other writers at conventions, and like he tends to go straight for like these physicists, but that's probably because he's friends with them, not like oh, I despise the writer and all his arrogance. Like maybe like actually like, oh, they're friends, they're buds, they're not going to exactly be interested in you, a fucking stranger. It's just how it goes, because he does seem like a very, I wouldn't say closed off, but like definitely the man's man idea of like I associate who I associate with, like just going with who I want to. Like he's very introverted, like likes to be closed off with his process and a lot of things like that.
Yeah, no. Have you ever read Ceremony by Leslie Marmon Silko?
I have actually, yeah, that book is amazing. Why'd you bring it up?
Yeah, no, it's amazing, right? It's another Southwest classic. And this is a funny note, bro. I've just never found time to tell everyone this. When he got the MacArthur Fellowship, he got invited to like the very first one. He gets invited and he gets to meet all these physicists. And in that recent interview, he said that there were these writers who also came and they were fish out of water. They didn't know what to do. Well, there were only two other ones. I can't remember the other one. They were just kind of a rando, and it was her. And so they were all sitting together. And for whatever reason, he didn't apparently like her and he didn't talk to her. And I was like, damn, like that's Leslie Marmon Silko. She's pretty good. Like she's like, but I'm like, oh man, like he really like that's like he really doesn't care. Like
Like I definitely could think of I think it might be because like during like the 80s and the 90s, I think there was like a certain uptick of like writers trying too hard, especially like around like I want to say like around the beatnik generation, like when the beat generation was starting to really pop off in terms of literature, like Bukowski, a lot of these guys being like sort of like anti-social social rejects from that type of situation there. So that might be like a stereotype he has at times. I can understand that. I mean, like Bukowski sounds like an asshole, but he's a great writer. Same for Miller, kind of an asshole, but genius writer in a lot of regards. I'm trying to think of other asshole writers, but I can't really think of any off the top of my head.
Hemingway at some level.
Oh yeah, Hemingway. That dude was an entire mental pot case of just like
Oh my
issues.
god.
I
No,
mean,
I know. I'm yeah. No,
I
I
mean,
love that's my favorite guy to psychoanalyze. And just I mean the Hemingway scholars, like it just is endless. Like just all the trauma that we know about his life, and he was much more social and like it was like, oh god, like Hemingway is
yeah, it
iceberg
seems
theory all day.
yeah, it's a common thing with writers. They're all fucked up. McCarthy less doesn't seem to have that, but immediately he does have quite the history and like back in his youth and with all his love life and that type of stuff. Like especially with your videos, like you really pointing out like how that influences writing, especially of Outer Dark, which that book I think is criminally underrated in the McCarthy pantheon. But that book is definitely like you can definitely see sort of like the influence his divorce had on there, as you pointed out specifically.
Yeah, no, I mean it's such a bizarre. It's Have you ever seen Eraserhead by David Lynch?
Oh yeah.
That's literally Eraserhead. He literally is getting divorced. He has all this anxiety about having a kid and a wife and all this, and he writes a book out of it about them killing the baby, them trying to get rid of the baby. And it was like kind of in the same era. I'm like, dang, like I mean, I guess that's just a common thing for men, like having to have a baby and like go through all that. And especially someone like a David Lynch or Cormac McCarthy, when you know that you're the best, when you know that you're good and you're hot shit. And I think that's one of the reasons he doesn't like other writers. I think it was like an early trauma. A lot of writers actually went through this. He was at university and he was writing and he was hanging around other writers. His first wife was a writer and she, had all these aspirations and dreams. And he produced The Orchard Keeper in like 3 years. And that's, if you can do that out of nowhere as a 26, 27, 28 year old, you're fucking talented. Like you're good. And like having to deal with professors and people that can't even write like you, I'm sure he got a bad taste in his mouth because you've said before that you've been in like workshops before, and it can be a little bit weird sometimes with a bunch of people that are dumber than you and they have no idea what's going on, especially if you're being aspirational. I've gotten some bad taste in my mouth before. Like, really, guys? Like,
Yeah, it definitely could feel like at times like you're dealing with people who don't really they don't necessarily want to write like a lot of like the best authors. Like I know people like say like, oh, it's a stereotype that you're romanticized like the suffering of the artist and all that type of stuff. But like admittedly, like a lot of good art comes out of from suffering. Like I forget what the name of that art is specifically, but he was this guy who painted his experiences and nightmares from after the Holocaust, and he's like these grotesque but horrifically like beautiful art pieces, and those are like hauntingly still. And then you get a lot of stuff from like our current era of like artistic majesty. I know we everyone dunks on modern art a lot, but it's for good reason. It just feels like at times it's not authentic really. Like it feels like it's trying too hard to be like either good writing or like trying too hard to be successful at times. And I think it's like a common issue nowadays. Like as you said a lot, the meritocracy in the publishing world is kind of non-existent. Like anyone can really make it, but at the same time you can't really boom as you want to a lot. And I think that could definitely like sour a lot of people towards writers, especially when you see what people like, how they write their things. Like there's not be people who know how to do like a sentence structure, nonetheless people who know how to do like stream of consciousness, third person, omniscient, limited, that type of stuff. It feels like a really like a lot of like downtrodden things to go through, sadly. Classic Spengler death of art kind of thing going on there.
yeah, no, I mean, and that's a whole other rabbit hole. I mean, like you said, I know guys who have PhDs and they can't write a proper sentence. Like they know nothing. Like you could get a PhD and not know how to write a sentence today in English or in creative writing. And like it's fucking wild. Like God, geez, like I mean,
I
even
know.
creative writing I mean, they don't even give grades anymore. Like in like workshop classes because of all the stuff. Like it's either pass or fail. Like you get an A. Like it's not like if you turn in a bad thing, that's shit. I mean, I remember like I had this very like liberal like kumbaya teacher, and we had to sit in the circle, and everyone had to say something nice about someone's work. And this chick wrote the worst fucking thing ever. It was about like a dog, and it just sucked. I mean, it was like a fourth grader wrote it, and she was like 20 something, and and it's my turn. I'm like, I have nothing nice to say, and that's all I said. I'm like, dude, like that should get an F. That's an F. Get her out of here. Put her.
I know. It's kind of ridiculous. Like I think one of the things that definitely has been kind of lost, and I think people have tried to like say McCarthy lost that too, is prose at times. Prose really has like gotten worse over the years, and it's like people misinterpret what Hemingway has always said about writing, like keep it simple. Never minding the fact like that whole conflict with Faulkner and Hemingway kind of hating each other and their styles of writing and how that was supposed to go down. Then you have guys like Bukowski who are like the urbanized, authentic prose, all gritty, all gross. You had Richard Wright, Donald Goines, that type of guys who are like very like gritty, very dark, very like simple prose. And Herbert Shelby Jr., which I have a book here of, but I can't pull it out versus those guys versus like Thomas Mann, Robert Musil, a lot of these guys who like focus on like beauty, the aesthetic of prose, Faust and Wolfgang and all that type of stuff there. And, the tragedy of man with Imre Madak, that type of stuff. Like the need for aesthetic and academic high intellectualism kind of dies out versus after like the Beat generation with a lot of like focus on like these very gritty, very dark, very shocking, very gross, or very sexual, very like offensive and controversial material in its own counterculture there with like how the beatniks and all that type of stuff was going down. And I think really like prose kind of got shifted in the wrong direction, like the no style. I think someone called it once, where like everyone has like the same kind of prose and it's all repetitive as hell, but people don't care because it's just like, hey, I want to read for the plot, I want to read for the story. And I know like prose is like the most important thing, but it's definitely a factor I think has lost consideration because like even Bukowski, like he was focused on like making the lines hit, making them hard, making them gritty, that type of stuff. And we don't even have that nowadays, and that fucking sucks a lot.
Yeah, I mean, even a guy like Bukowski who wasn't writing too complicated, his lines hit. I mean, that's why you like him. I mean, he was hitting, and that's what's really weird now. Like you're saying, most of the time, it's like what's the voice, what's the plot, what's the angle, and what makes all. I mean, as you know, as everyone knows, all stories are just retold basically. And so, what makes it fun is the prose, is the syntax, is the contrast, and those little nuggets that you get beyond the story, and that gives life. I mean, and so it's I could go on all day, man. Like I love sentence structure, and I think that, and and then speaking to the dumbing down of just people in general, that you can't even produce that. You can't even give that. I mean, I've tried to write like wicked firestorm prose, and like people can't process it. They're like, I got a headache. Like I can't. I wasn't. I'm too tired to read this. I'm like, yeah. Like, geez.
It is really weird how that happens. It's mainly like a Western like sort of like issue. Like down in Spain and Mexico, you got guys like Carlos Ruiz Zafón, like Jose Lezama Lima, like a lot of guys who have like a very like strong Spanish prose. Like I always felt like has been consistently good. Less like it's
Yeah.
Mexican American literature, like Mexican Gothic. Mexican Gothic ranges in quality like horrifically at times.
Yeah.
But there's a very like there was always like there was never like a shift over here like our beatnik generation. It was always like sort of like a focus on Spanish romanticism and like a very like Hawthorne-esque prose, like a lot of questionable stuff. Like Jorge Luis Borges, like his spirit is like all of these books. And it actually leads to me a question regarding McCarthy. Like he has a like apparently he has like a deep hatred for like magical realism. And I always kind of
Yeah.
find that a bit funny. That's like because he has like a hatred for like a lot of Spanish literature, and I never I can understand that why, but I always find it interesting with his contrast with like spiritualism in his works. I always wonder like what was your thought on that specifically?
Yeah, well, that's actually really funny because you would because he seems to hide a lot of the magical realism and spiritualism, because to say that he's not doing it is dumb, because if you look at the Sutri, the Crossing, I guess those are probably the biggest ones. He is infusing magical realism within them. There are these stories and like weird stuff going on. And if you start going deeper, there are synchronicities. If we're looking at the Passenger and Stella Maris, depending on how you interpret it, it could be seen as all a hallucination. And I don't know if it's just like, I don't want to take the easy answer. I've never actually thought about this too deeply. Is it just like him? I'm sure there's a lot of people that view like Hispanic prose is like lesser than, like even like Roberto Bolano versus David Foster Wallace, or like that whole era, like of '90s writers, like they'll shit on Roberto Bolano. Like it's I mean, what's the Pedro Paramo? Is that one?
I think it is Pedro Paramo. I think that's his name
Yeah, like
specific.
people will. I mean, people. That's a classic, but no one knows about it. I mean, generally, I don't know if it's just unaccepted. People, I've heard people. I have a friend who reminds me of you a lot, and he's like getting his PhD in like all in like Mexican literature, and he chalks it up to that. We just can't handle the spirit down here. We don't understand it. The white people don't understand it.
I
I
mean,
don't
like
know. I don't.
I mean, like
I just,
Mexicans and like a lot of Spanish literature is very like spiritual. It's just not spiritual in like McCarthy sense or like a lot of like religious iconography and stuff like that. It's more like Haruki Murakami in kind of way, like a very like
yeah,
weirdly sexual, weirdly like alien and like bizarre and kind of quirky at times, like like talking to cats with like Kafka on the Shore, a lot of like stuff like that specifically. Or you have like Jorge Luis Borges, who's like sort of like a that bordering between like the European like ideas of like religious ideas and like subconscious and his whole identity thing, right? In God that regard, as well as like Berkeleyan like subjective idealism, a lot of concepts of identity that he likes to study and analyze with time and physics and stuff like that. But then he'll have like a story about like a Spanish conquistador going around killing like thousands of knights and having sex with a hot sexy woman in the same breath. And I think it's because a lot of the times like Spanish literature gets viewed as pulpy a lot of the times, like because like
Yeah.
there is a love for pulps down there, like a lot of like Robert E. Howard, like Conan the Barbarian type of stuff. Like even with Robert E. Howard being viewed as more literature nowadays, like he still gets a lot of shit from like even like mainstream guys, like called like a hack, a fraud, this and that, make like worthless stories. Versus like Lovecraft, who's more philosophical, more high brow, high art. It's a classic avant-garde and kitsch thing we've always had this issue with back in the day. Like with Mexican literature, I do understand though, because like a lot of it does feel kind of like pulpy, like a focus on sex, a lot of violence, or a lot more just like romanticism prose, or like detective stories, like over in Italy for a time, like even with like the neo noir fiction over in Italy, like those books range a lot in like how they're accepted as literature. Like the guy who wrote Two Women, I forget what his name was, but that guy, even with his like that book becoming literature, it has like a lot of like people who were lambasted as like pulp garbage and trash and exploited propaganda pulp basically. And I always find that interesting, like how that sort of goes, but I'm not sure how to like really
I
describe that phenomenon.
I mean, I think it honestly just goes back to that he is just like a typical, pretty close-minded, rigid white man with that ideology. Because we think of his influences, we think of Faulkner and Frost. They are like the antithesis of the Spanish symbolists, Cesar Vallejo and even Antonio Machado. Like all those guys, those are two massively different lineages. Even the King James Bible Melvillian lineage. And a lot of these guys, if we're looking at Frost, McCarthy, Faulkner, just that whole little group, Robinson Jeffers, they weren't dealing with, like you said, with a lot of these weird topics, which you could say they weren't really dealing with their soul. They weren't really going too internally. Um, you know, because like there's guys, like Carlos Fuentes, who wrote The Death of Artemio Cruz. That guy was like, and Roberto Bolaño, they were like certified crazy. Like they were like loony bin crazy. Like I
Yeah.
think Carlos Fuentes believed like there were alligators living under Mexico City, like legit believed it. And like, and that's okay. Like that's okay. And that produces a different artist. Like you said, it's more the Haruki Murakami like type. And I think McCarthy just sees it as this like kidsy stuff. Like that's not what men do. That's not like real writing like that.
Yeah.
And he probably he's never, and his love of physics and whatnot, and his focus on that, he's probably never tapped into that more like spiritual, like subjective side, even though he does. But
Yeah, it's more so like I mean like even with like the Stella Maris, with that focus on like solipsism, and that being like the only real thing. Like it definitely does feel like McCarthy. He's more viewed in like theology, like Thomas Aquinas, like kind of like very materialism, kind of like immateriality concepts there, rather than like say dude, there's like a fucking like ghost that comes around in the village and like drowns your kids, man. You gotta fucking run from that shit. Like,
yeah, yeah,
lot more skepticism, a lot more goofy, like scare your kids type of stuff. Like, yeah, I remember as well, like he hated like Proust or Proust, whatever you want to say. I don't care how you pronounce his name. But he adores commas. Like it's very much like focused. I think like he kind of hates ghosts as a concept a lot. And I mean, like a
yeah.
lot of people like hate like ghosts as well, but if I recall, he really did not like Turn of the Screw and the whole ideas with that one specifically. And I adore that book specifically, but I can understand like sort of like the hate for that specifically if you're not interested or invested in like the concept of like the afterlife as like an intangibility, basically.
And he did. I mean, this is another huge factor. He did come to um like his own during the hippie era. He was, what was, in his 30s during all that, and that probably gave a big distaste. And even the beat era, and we do know that he took LSD. He did take LSD at some point, but I know a lot of guys that took LSD and did nothing for him.
Yeah.
It didn't awaken them, and they didn't go down that path. And so seemingly he does reject that, because he does start. He in that Krauss interview, he does call himself a materialist. So seemingly he's been moving toward that his entire life. And I don't know what would happen if he at some point went the other direction.
Yeah, it
Like,
is
what if
like a
he had an awakening?
yeah. Yeah, I mean, like the Sunset Limited, like I think it always felt like it was about McCarthy's like views on like God and land science and religion and things like that. Because he very much like he says like you have to ask him like on what specific day of what he's feeling then. And that book very much feels like the eternal conflict of like God and faith versus like the very hard truth of science. Like I know this idea is like very controversial, but like I think as well, like the blind brain theory, I think was becoming popular around the time that was coming up, and that theory gets lambasted like to hell and back because it's Sam Harris, and Sam Harris is kind of a hack fraud at times. But as well as like R. Scott Baker and his whole ideas like the Last Magic Show, like it's a very controversial subject, but like in an age of science where our concept of free will is getting like less and less like authentic and more so like a case of like ethical philosophy to a certain extent, you can very much see like sort of like like this flip flop and this need for like that religious spirit at times, but also like sort of like maybe combining the two as well in a lot of regards, because that book it very much like focuses on like string theory a lot and like sort of like how those bundles sort of tie us together. And I always found like there's maybe some hints of like Asian symbolism that was sort of like intertwined with it. Because like I know that mention of the jinn was probably like a snapshot on like people who thought like the kid and like the Holden were like jinns and all that type of stuff. Like it's too simple and too like spiritual of a concept for McCarthy. But it also feels like at times like a sort of hints towards like the like a lot of Eastern mythos and like sort of like how that combines with our focus on like quantum physics and how that can affect us, that type of thing as well. But maybe that's a bit too much of a reach on my end specifically.
No, I think that even though we've been kind of dunking on McCarthy saying that he's not awakened, I would say that his love of nature and the time that he spent out there, and that he just has the artistic drive in general, mm, that it's almost a guarantee that he's going to be more open and more, and obviously because he's a huge reader, have encountered the East, because like you said, quantum physics, and even a lot of quantum physics, we know he's read Heidegger, we know he's like all that was inspired by Eastern philosophy. And as someone as well read as him, it would be dumb to think that he hadn't explored all of that.
Yeah, and you can definitely feel like, because I think like to a certain extent, if you're reading philosophy, you're always going to encounter the people who are quoting like the Buddhism, like even with those texts being like inaccurate with their actual descriptions, you can see a lot of like the spirit of like Eastern mythos a lot of times with nature, and how sort of like nature is kind of empty at the same time, it's very primordial, and you can see that clash at times with how McCarthy describes the earth and things like that. And I think Blood Meridian as well has like a very keen focus on nature, like specifically like in his notes he talks about the Urschleim, which was a kind of concept like this primordial slime, a protoplasm that that we all rose up from, that was made from Ernst Haeckel, I think was his name specifically, Ernst Haeckel. Yeah, it's basically like this intense focus on like on Monera kind of existence there, and the fact that it was McCarthy like had like that mention towards it for a Earthstone with a certain native tribe that was actually kind of real, specifically with Garden their mythos, and sort of combining that as well. You can see like a lot of the focus and the compilation of like our nature, our very like primordial existence and things like that, and sort of like the mythical spiritual side within Blood Meridian, like this grand like religiosity and like heresy and a lot of things like that specifically. I always found that kind of like interesting to see, especially with like the focus on like humanity itself being very primordial and very base at times. Like we're so connected to our inner nature and how that drives us at times, but we also have our nature, our civilization specifically, that sort of drives us and sort of contains our nature in a way. Marquez de Sade had like a very good essay regarding that. Like a lot of his books are focused on that specifically. Like his character aside, like I think like at times like McCarthy kind of invokes like that economy a lot, like same way de Sade did, but like not as like much of a satire as he did back in the day.
No, 100%. And I mean, I think that one of the best criticisms, some of the best McCarthy criticism explores the nature. I mean, I think that's where McCarthy shines more so than, I mean, all the people we talked about that he inspired. I mean, of Western writers, he has probably one of the deepest conceptions of nature. And we could, and he almost balances it because he does have the mythopoetic side that we see in The Crossing and even Blood Meridian. And then he has the very more biological scientific approach. But if if you have that scientific approach, you're going to take a very, like, it's almost interconnected because you realize it's all primordial. If you look at like the Kukule problem, like he is understanding our drive for symbolism as coming from nature, and it's like yeah, so
Yeah, classic Durkheim right there, symbolic interactionism and how we interact with symbols and how what that means for us on like a sociological level in a lot of ways. And I always felt Whales and Men was sort of that consideration of like not necessarily the alien specifically, but like sort of like the dichotomy of like how we humans view ourselves. Like we're very myopic at times in how we discuss and we view our ideas and our framework of the world because yeah, we are kind of an anomaly in a lot of ways, like how we function. But we have that sort of like interesting like nature of like uh dolphins and whales, their own kind of language, their own kind of herd mentality and their own mental processes, and we always just say like oh like they don't really think, maybe we don't really like take them too seriously. But whales and men and the calculate problem, like you can very much see like that focus on like maybe the world is a bit more spiritual even within a scientific framework at times. Like I think definitely you can see like sort of like maybe not like the Wittgenstein that a lot of people like trust more, but like the Tractatus Philosophicus Logicus Wittgenstein a lot of the times that focus on like the atomistic like framework of logic. Like even the logic is faulty. That sense of logic has a sense of facts that bundle itself up together and definitely sort of like makes its own sense of like reality at times, like that atomistic individualism, and at times like sort of like how we don't really take that too seriously when it comes to animals and their herds because of how we view complexity, how we view nature. Well, that could be wrong entirely. And I think like a major thing with Holden as a character and, the Thelemite kid or TK, we call him TK because that word's kind of hard to annoy to pronounce. It's very much like a focus of, like our reality is so much more like alien and crazy and absurd in a lot of the ways at times. And really like, yeah, our worldview kind of doesn't make sense, but like our definitions and our standards, they always are going to shift and they're always going to fall before something inevitably. And I think a lot of times like Holden and these type of characters, like they're sort of like an argument from that book. And we try to like counteract that as the layman, basically. Like we try to find ways to work around that, and we don't really have the answers at times. Like it's kind of like an aspect of those books, like a common motif at times.
yeah, like you were saying, that's somewhat. We were talking about magical realism, but I mean, he's somewhat. That's like almost Murakami-esque, with the TK and then Judge Holden, like all these characters, like they. I mean, he is doing magical realism at some level. I mean, it's crazy. Even though it is, what did you think of in The Passenger, the scenes with the thalidomide kid?
I obviously was like at first like kind of confused because it's just like wow, this page is going on for a while, but then
Yeah.
I sort of like because I kind of started realizing like okay, so yeah, this is obviously like our titular Stella Maris, our schizophrenic insane woman, our beloved Alice and Alicia, whatever you want to call her specifically. Uh, she's a very like interesting individual, like a hyperactive imagination because of her hallucinations, and I think like a very interesting thing about that book with Othello, my kid, is that he is speaking nonsense. Like he is like saying just like jargon and garbage. And I think it's like McCarthy kind of poking fun of himself at times. Like just like saying like, yeah, I use big words, but like these words have a purpose. This kid's just talking out of his ass, but there's a wisdom in his absurdity because he sort of like embraces the chaos of the universe a lot. Like the universe doesn't make sense. It's nonsense. And he's kind of embracing that throughout the entirety of the book. And the Thelma kid, since he has this awareness, he's still happy. And him being connected towards as a collective hallucination between Alice and Bobby, I think it kind of speaks towards like the grander spiritual side towards the physics in that book. And I always found that like an interesting aspect. It's still an aspect I had to like discuss and try to analyze, but it's such like a hauntingly beautiful character because of how grotesque and disgusting he is. It's like a chimera.
Yeah, no, 100%. Do you think the hate for those two books was just because of the buildup, because we waited so long, because or was it because it just got out to people that really weren't McCarthy fans because of how big of a book launch it was?
I think it's one because of a collective like too many people. Two, people expecting a plot. I know it's like a lot of people saying that, like, oh, there's like the plot went nowhere, and like a lot of people who aren't used to a lot of the ideas of like McCarthy was going to, and a lot of people kind of being alienated because of like these more focus on physics, on like these grander scale ideas that are a bit more complex for most people who are kind of a layman. It's not a common McCarthy book where you have like a very human. No, wait, no, I shouldn't say that. Like, it's a very human story at its core. Like, even for all the physics and all this type of stuff, it's about life with Bobby, and it's about death and like sort of like the issue of living with Alice, and like sort of like the focus on our sort of like ourselves in a lot of ways. Like, it's a very grief focused book. Like with Bobby, it's like he's the passenger to life. He just goes around, does what he does. He just lives the day to the day, and it's all trying to focus on coping with his grief. And we don't even know if it's real. We don't even know if it's just all unreliable narration. But we do feel like there's like this sense of like just like life kind of goes on. Like nothing gets solved. A lot of conspiracies happen. You don't really learn a lot. There's a government conspiracy happening. You're not going to be privy to it. You're just kind of going by your day to day, and it's just how it goes. And the last book there is just going to be sort of like that's just how it goes for the all-encompassing reality for ourselves at times, versus like just sort of like the death of like civilization of the world, this like religion and spirituality, like a lot of these concepts being broken down, and like even the concept of like collective like sort of identity that sort of dies with like within Stella Maris. And I think a lot of times like the hate for these books comes from the fact like these ideas people just couldn't really like get into them because they were too theme heavy, I guess. But it's very intertwined with like the whole point of the book. Like it's like these books can't be without the other. You need life, you need death, you need death, and you need life. These two need each other. And if you read one book without reading the other, you lose so much. I think people were too focused on like what's gonna happen here? What's gonna happen here? What's gonna happen here? Like it's so non-traditional. Even with Stella Mars, like there's like next to none, no prose. It's just pure dialogue, and it's like it's convention breaking even for McCarthy in a lot of ways, and that's why I think there was like such a lack, like so much like people going back against it, like backlash and all that type of stuff.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. I mean, I think that yeah, like when I reread it, I was like, man, like he really you can really see how he worked on this for 60 fucking years, which I don't understand how that's even how that what kind of grind that's like, man. I mean, that's like bigger than our combined age. But did
I
you
know. Go ahead.
did you so you don't think it could have been one book? That's just something that I heard that it should have just been one book. Like the italicized sections, like he could have combined it all.
Oh no, I don't believe that at all. I think people who say that are kind of in the wrong there. I feel like these books had to be their own thing. Like they're too much of like they make you question like the reality of both of those books and like which is real, which is false, which is true, which one's actually telling the truth in a lot of regards, which one's actually like the accurate reality. It's there's two books with two separate identities and two different spirits and voices, and that's why even like the fucking covers themselves are like they
Yeah.
make up each other. They're interconnected. They're separated,
Yeah.
but they're interconnected. And if you were to keep them together, I think you would have a book that's very experimental and very much more like maybe satisfying for people, but they would still have the same issues and things like that. I feel like if you were to like separate these books, like you just like lose way too much. Not separate. I mean, like put them together. Like they need to be separated because they need to feel like there's a piece missing, like there's a puzzle or like there's something like it's not there that should be there for both of them. And I feel like that's why these books should be separated. And that's why they should be their own thing specifically. It's very much. I think this is like sort of like the height of like what a literary work can be. Like quite literally like these books cannot go without each other, and it's like sort of like the encompassing beauty of those two specifically.
Yeah, and I read that McCarthy was done with The Passenger in like 2013, 2014, and then he started like on Stella Maris and like grinding that out. And do you think that he reverted to the dialogue only format because of his comfort, like being so comfortable with the screenplays?
Maybe. I think like it's a mix of like I think it's also like a character thing specifically. Like Stella herself, like we get an idea of like of what she views in The Passenger, obviously, like sort of like that thin line connection of like prose and ideas. But this book is like purely her. Like she's like this very like saintly, like sort of like alien figure. She's so like out of depth in this world. Like she doesn't even process the prose or like anything like around her, like no settings, no sense of like being or identity or like any like imagery or things like that. It's just her specifically, just her words, her actions, and we don't even get to see her like her inner internal monologue or anything like that. Just her specifically, like everything about her just isolated. Like that book was her. It was completely her personality, her spirit, her character. It consumed everything in that book, and that's really a beautiful thing. Like specifically, like she just only had the therapist there, and even then, he barely talks. It's just long passages of just her talking. It's I think it's like probably McCarthy's like most like character voice driven like authorial voice he's done in a bit like in terms of narration. So it's like Suttree.
Yeah. Would you? Okay. What do you think of the theory that Alicia is the passenger, that the suicide wasn't real?
Ooh, I read that theory specifically, and I've always like I've been trying to wonder on that because this book is like it's complex. So I like it's just like
Yeah.
you got to question so much about it. But I've always kind of felt like maybe it is true. Like maybe it is the fact of like she is sort of like the passenger too. Like I think because I always felt like it was some weird like quantum physics McCarthy was going for here, like sort of like a pseudo like quantum physical like immortality,
Yeah.
like quantum suicide, that type of stuff like there, like multiverse and that type of thing. But it definitely felt like that too. Like I like it's such an integral part of her character too. Like she's kind of I don't want to say pretentious, like there are small mistakes she makes throughout the books regarding like physics and things like that. But it's such an integral part of her identity. I can feel like at times like maybe that is the case. Maybe she is the passenger and she never did kill herself. And that's just Bobby's view of that in like his coma or like how he understood it typically. And I feel like with TK, like that sort of represents like she sort of still lives on in a way, maybe. Because like TK is like a shared hallucination that he really shouldn't have known about at all because of like, how her schizophrenia and how that sort of developed over the years and the timing and everything like that. Again, this book is like ridiculously like complex, so it's an interesting theory, and that just adds like a whole bunch of layers I can't even begin to like touch upon
Dude,
really.
the timelines are all fucked up, like with the years and the timelines. Like I'm already trying to like that, like there's stuff off, and I'm like, he worked on this so long that it can't be that. It can't be that fucked up. Like
Yeah.
and there was an editor, and like it was in the work since 2013, like with the editor. So like they seemingly, I mean, maybe we'll get that later on with like the editor if they had any type of correspondence. Probably not, but because like when I think of like him out on the rig, like who was out there with him? There was someone on the boat with him, and I'm like you were saying, if she was alive, she probably wasn't on the fucking boat. That'd be weird. But seemingly it is airing toward some multiverse physics, quantum physics interpretation.
Yeah, the good old quantum immortality. Like you're dead in one multiverse, but you're alive in this one. You can never die. That type of horror spiel type of shit right there. It's such an interesting little thing right there. I'm not sure McCarthy went like to that extent, but it like the shared hallucination. That's like the big thing right there. Like how the fuck did Bobby
Yeah,
know about that? What's going on there? Is this like a real entity? Are the horrors real? Maybe it's just like saying like something about schizophrenia being like not as like bad of like an illness as we thought it was. Like that type of thing really because I always found that line about we try to understand like we understand like the particles of light and stuff like that, but we never try to understand like the makeup of shadow, the makeup of darkness specifically. Like anti
yeah,
gravity, like dark matter, all this type of stuff. Like we kind of like skid around that because it's like it's literally like the impossible universe, like the impossible quantum realm that we can't really like touch properly. And that's like sort of like the scary aspects of the world specifically. Like there's already so much about quantum physics that we do know, and so much more we just don't understand specifically. And it's such a like God, this book is just so fucking good. I love it so much. I don't. That's why I'm so frustrated with like the hate for it and the pushback because it's
yeah.
just such a it's peak McCarthy for me. Like Blood Meridian, I think is like his magnum opus, but this is also like at the top right there, standing alongside the two. Just like such a viscerally, like it makes you just want to try to piece it together, understand it. And I've been rereading it nonstop. I've been trying to figure out everything about it. I'm still asking questions. That's just how good it is.
Yeah, no, I've lost what I was going to say, but yeah, I mean, in what you said earlier, yeah, sorry. What you said earlier about it being like it literally was like a run through of all McCarthy. Like we literally went back to Tennessee. We went to the West. We were in New Orleans, which was never really a spot, but like we went to all these different locations. Even in his life, they were in Tucson. He lived in Tucson. The Glanton gang. It was like all this kind of random stuff, and it was like some of the scenes I was like, dude, this is like Suttree meets The Crossing, like. And I think a lot of people DNF'd it and didn't get past the first 150 pages. They didn't really
Uh,
see like where it was going. I think that's a lot of people didn't finish it. I was like, anyone that did finish this, I don't see how they could have a problem with it.
yeah, this book definitely just feels like a love letter to like everything McCarthy cared about in his literature and his writing and stuff like that. It's very human oriented with the passenger. Like Bobby has a connection with people, very much like that sense of like longing and like comfort with people, the sense of connection, like identity and answers that he wanted. And the end of the book, like he doesn't really get much of like any comfort or solace. He just kind of like, I would say, like comes to terms with his grief, and he just sort of like collapses, and he just sort of like encompasses like Bobby is really like sort of like the spirit of like humanity in a lot of ways. Like there's obviously like the Jesus parallels, as you pointed out in your video. He's very much like with the iconic Stella Maris. That's like specifically like the Virgin Mary representation there with Alice and everything like that. And it's such a like they're so in tandem with each other in terms of symbolism and iconography. The incest stuff, I don't know what. I think it's just like an outer dark maybe there, but like I definitely think it's like it's such a like a conventions of like Southern Gothic literature and sort of like how that's been brought to the modern day. That just America, poking the fun out of stuff like that. Classic like Pike inspiration McCarthy has in his stuff right there.
Do you think that she got an abortion? Did you see that line? When he's in Idaho, he has a line where um, he was talking to a doctor and there was an abortion performed on her without her knowledge that she was pregnant.
Yeah,
It
I've
could
always
be a
heard the
dream or it could be real.
could be real, could be a dream, could be like something that actually did happen because it is heavily implied they did have sex, and it was sort of again, it was in classic weird McCarthy fashion. It's kind of implied she manipulated him into it, and it's like a weird like rape power dynamic that gets sort of weird, and it's like again like McCarthy asking the hard questions there, like how comfortable that was. And I always heard the theory that the TK kid is specifically like their kid. It came out wrong, and that's kind of like one of the reasons why like Alice is described as like having bulimia at times and stuff like that. Like she's very like sickly
Okay.
looking. Yeah, she's like
That would make sense.
yeah,
Yeah.
like very sickly looking, very like traumatized. Like it's like we could probably make a theory like the birth, like the trauma of the birth, like kind of like enhance her schizophrenia because like SIDS and like a lot of women with postpartum pregnancy depression, like they're not usually fine after that state, and especially if she was so young and she might have had this abortion, or the TK kid specifically, like they might have birthed it in the hospital, tried to hide it and stuff like that. It came out all wrong, and now it's like literally haunting her. It would be weird if she she never mentions it, but at the same time, it's like she's such a closed off person, even in the passenger, like even by like one of the few times we get into her head and see her world, like she's so closed off and like inalien and like insociable and stuff like that. Like she's even like she feels disconnected even from herself at times. And Selamar,
Yeah.
I think,
I
is
mean,
like
yeah. Go on. No, go on.
yeah, Stella Maris is like she breaks down essentially. Like she has that because like Bobby is that human connection, like the thing that makes her not like a symbol of intelligence and beauty, but like a girl with very much like fucked up sexual identity issues and frustrating like views of the world. Like even like it's weird. Like she gets more emotional for Bobby, and she's very like closed off and like intimate with him and very much comforting and caring and things like that. Like she tries rationalizing the sex and things like that, and she tries rationalizing her own actions. but she mentioned her rape so offhandedly as well. But like the very concept of Bobby like coming in to protect her, like she just like I feel like in a lot of ways, like Alice, she's very much like a not necessarily like a man child, but like very like infantile and like sort of like that's how she copes a lot. Like intelligence was her means of like finding her own power in a lot of ways, and like how she can only really like feel kind of anything besides with Bobby. Like even with like her discussion on her father, like she just views him very indifferently. But Bobby, like it's such a weird like connection to him. And I think this is where I think there might be some of the Kafka on the Shore inspiration there. I'm not sure if McCarthy ever read Murakami, but like that transient incest and spiritualism there with connections there, like I think that's kind of like a Kafka on the Shore symbolic like illusion there in a lot of ways.
Imagine Cormac McCarthy sitting down in New Mexico. He opens it up. Who's this Murakami guy? And there's this kid getting on a bus, and he meets his maybe sister, and he's getting a hand job from her just to help him sleep better. I'm just gonna imagine McCarthy loving that. It's like, yeah, uh,
Fuck yeah, incest
um,
man.
yeah, I love this stuff. I write about this all the time. Hell yeah. Um,
I,
um, yeah,
as well. I feel like it might be like also like a Sound of the Fury type of thing, like Quentin and Caddy's relationship. Like Quentin lying about like him having incest with Caddy to protect her, and ends up failing the type of thing. Maybe not because like I feel like maybe it's just like a thing of like Southern cultural identity. Like America, like we have like the incest punchline a lot of the times. Like we do have like 10% of the population I think like commits incest here, which kind of fucked, but whatever. Can move past that. It is like sort of like a I think like a weird like aspect of that whole thing because like it feels like a very like oh it's a brother sister bond. We have like this weird symbolic imagery of like Bobby being Jesus, her like the Virgin Mary, but inverted in a lot of ways. And then it's just like the incest thing. It's just like okay, what are you doing here, McCarthy? That's a bit weird. Are you just trying to like discuss incest again? Because like he definitely has like a view on that like with like naturalism and sin with Outer Dark and like Outer Dark as well. Like that has a weird like spiritual side with like the trio and like how they're like these representations like the super ego, the id, a lot of these like concepts of like evil and natural Freudian symbolism. Oh, Freud, incest, penis envy. I just fucking barely connected that. Wow. Anyway,
yeah.
like a lot of like these psychological things about incest. Like I always wondered why McCarthy wanted to focus on that and like why that was such an integral thing for Alice and like how she views herself really. Like she definitely has like an issue like being objectified in a lot of ways, but like it's such a weird aspect of her character and I always found that like such an interesting thing that he does. Maybe it's just like his classic like Southern Gothic thing coming out there because like incest is like a common like thing to discuss in those books because of like how common it was in the South with like the royalty and how even in the decline of that, it's been sort of like keeps going on in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, it seemingly is at the most basic level used as a plot driver because, like you said, here's Alicia. She's hyper rational. She only feels through Bobby, indifference to a lot of other things. And she is with him, and the prose and the stories come to life when they're together, especially like when she's younger. But seemingly, Bobby flees, whether that is because of a birth or a pregnancy or just because he's scared. I mean, seemingly he's scared of her and scared of that interaction for whatever reason. And so he flees, and that's what really starts to throw Alicia down the well, as Murakami would say. And yeah, and so like I some great points there about like you said the trauma of birth and like all that because like you said if she was experiencing abortions I mean, I think that's in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, and when she was in that framing of that time of the novel in the novel. That's huge. I mean, imagine what that did to her. Yeah, just what that did to her in general.
Yeah,
So what did? Yeah, sorry.
I was about to say, she's like maybe she feels like a bit of guilt too for what she did to Bobby. Because again, we're not sure what happened there between them, but they both feel like a sense of guilt. Like obviously, Bobby feels like a guilt for not being there for her, but also because like maybe like feeling like a sense of attraction in return. And she kind of feels guilty about the fact she wasn't there for him, but also because like she's so in love with him and just like so deeply cares for him, and yet she can't express it beyond like a sexual. thing specifically. Like, and again, like there's a weird like I won't say Bobby's like retarded or anything like that. Like I feel like he's just kind of like a bit, bit he's sociable, but he's a bit slow in a lot of ways, like how he's described, like a classic football bro in a lot of ways. And that's why I always feel like their power dynamic was so inverted. Like she's like this super intelligent, super smart girl, but he honestly cares about her. But she's a freaky kid. Like a lot, like that whole scene, like it feels like a weird like horror movie where like she said like she's describing like how she confessed to him and everything like that. Like we don't get a Bobby perspective at all, and I could feel like how uncomfortable he felt in the car. And it's
Yeah.
just like I felt for the dude, and like I feel even worse for him because like she kind of I feel like she kind of used him in a bit of a weird way. Like it's a weird sense of love they have. Anyway, what were you going to ask specifically regarding something?
Nothing. No, nothing, man. I mean, it's beautiful, man. A beautiful young love. And yeah, I mean, like you were saying, it is a great because whatever happened, he got driven to go become a race car driver, and it was a reckless that's a reckless pursuit. I mean, he's not experienced in that. He's going to go do Formula 1 or wherever it was, and eventually he goes into a coma, like he's escaping that trauma. I mean, something like you said, there's a guilt there, and I don't think that him just being in love with his sister is enough. Him
Yeah,
just liking her and thinking that she's kind of hot or whatever. I don't think that's enough to drive you. And then the passenger, like we know he's maybe guilty about her death, but excuse me, not the passenger, but him being a deep sea diver and taking risks and doing all that. What is that about? Like seemingly he's fleeing. And there's
yeah,
metaphors there with the ocean, and there's metaphors in the sense if you want to go even deeper. Why are they the westerns? It's the westerns in Whales and Men with
yeah,
the ocean. Joe,
exactly.
it's like what?
I know. And he was writing the script around that same time too, so definitely like an alignment of like the parallels there, and also with like a race car driver, it's like it's a very symbolic thing of like going in circles, trying to run away from something and trying to finish off the finish line, but like you always keep driving around the same corners and the same thing, and like definitely like it's symbolic of like him having her in his mind always all the time, and it's always driving him, like literally driving him to do these like selfless, like daring things. And a lot of times, like trying to find answers and trying to like sort of understand like why did I do what I do in a lot of ways. And that's what I found like such an interesting thing with the two and their connection. Like Alicia, like I'm not sure what like her mental psyche, her mental makeup. Like she's a very much a human being, but she's so mentally out there. Like she's literally like among the stars. Like her name literally has Stella in there. It's such a beautiful and tragic like dynamic they have, and I think that's like definitely like something that's like building off Outer Dark and the whole concept of like naturalism and sin, and entering like the ethics like more of our modern day, and like the transition there with how their love is specifically, and like sort of like the dilemmas there specifically. And it's such a like it's uncomfortable. I'm not gonna lie, I was uncomfortable. I think everyone was kind of uncomfortable with their dynamic. I think Bobby as well, but it's like it's so weirdly beautiful in how grotesque and uncomfortable it is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, here's a fire thing I just thought of. Her the thalidomide kid he came with the onset of menstruation, and with the onset of menstruation comes obviously the reality, if she was already in love with her brother, of what a child could become, you know what I mean, of if they made love and made a baby, what that was going to be, obviously, because that incest creates, I'm sure she's smart enough to know what that makes, and so yeah, I mean, it's all these little tiny things that connect in this novel.
I know that's why I was viewed as like a magnum opus. Like I think people get too much caught in like the physics at times, and like they don't really focus on like the very human centered ideas like love, grief, life, trying to cope with like a lot of the unanswerable things of aspects of life. And at times, I think that's like one of the reasons I think McCarthy kind of doesn't like an author like Marcel Proust, where because they get so caught up in the physics and all these like other stuff right here and there, and sort of like the spirituality. It's just like it's not about the life and the death and like the struggles we have. It doesn't connect too much to us in a lot of ways. It's just a quibble of what we're going through a lot of the times, like those human
Yeah.
irrationalities, even within the most rational person in a lot of ways. And I know McCarthy probably has mixed opinions on Jung, but you definitely can see that sort of like active consciousness versus like the subconsciousness and the greater unconsciousness, like the whole lot of the concepts at times with like how we view psychology and how our minds work at times, like our own innate nature. And this works more so in the tandem of love, specifically with McCarthy and what he's focusing on there, and sort of like the inalienable mental psyche and how distant that can become for us.
Yeah, I mean, he for sure obviously does have. I made a video on it, and I'd actually been reading some new stuff on McCarthy and Jung. He has super mixed opinions, but if he would have, he is one a storyteller, a reader of psychology, someone who deals with archetypes and these weird characters. He's smart. We were saying he probably knows Freud. We know he does because he was talking about them in the book. So